Eric, Bill, Mike.
Hi.
I don't have the most attractive background. I apologize. It's your tax dollars at work. That's what it is.
I like it. That looks like an office that has a lot of work being done in it.
You have no idea. More over here too. Mike, your hair looks very suave this morning.
Yeah, it's getting very long. It's been since January.
I usually see it without the styling. That's the problem.
Yeah. This is like the first
for those
in a while.
For those who are attending right now, as you can hear, all of our panelists are here and they're ready to begin. We have about 5 minutes to go until the official start time, and we expect to be starting a few minutes after, just to let everyone who may be running late to join us. And I will let everyone know when we're going to be starting. Just as an update, we are currently recording. So this recording will be provided to everyone who registered to this event via email with a link from the chapter. And we should be starting in just a few more minutes. All right, it looks like we've hit noon. I think we'll just give a few more minutes before to anyone to join us before we start. I will make an announcement with further information once the session begins. All right, I think with that final loop of the intro video, we can begin our session. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending Creative Reuse in the Capital Region, Lessons from Practitioners, today's session for the APA New York Upstate Chapter 2020 Conference. My name is Jeremy Monty, and my colleague Paige Barnum and I will be your hosts for this session. Before we get started, we would like to thank our session sponsor, Barton LaJudas. Without our partners, this virtual conference would not be possible. All of our sessions are being recorded and will be available online through the New York Upstate Chapter's website. Links will be provided to you directly as videos become available and are posted. So the format for today's session is as follows. After this brief introduction by myself, I will turn it over to our moderator, Julian Adams, Program Coordinator for the New York State Division for Historic Preservation, who will introduce the panel. Then each panelist will speak over a brief presentation where they will describe their professional experiences and what they are bringing to the panel. Following this introduction, Julian will begin our panel discussion. All attendees will be muted during this session. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. Questions for the panelists added to the chat box will not be addressed. Questions will be answered on a rolling basis throughout the discussion period. So if you have a question at any point during this session, please do not hesitate to add it to the Q&A box. And one last update to our panel before we begin. Unfortunately, Stacy Kaplowitz, Vice President of Development for KCG Companies, is no longer able to join us. So our panel will be 5 instead of 6. And with that, I will now turn it over to Julian, who will begin our session.
Thank you, Jeremy. Can everybody hear me? So yes, I've had some tech problems this morning, so bear with me. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We have a good panel here today. I'm not going to give all their bios, but I just want to say that I've worked with several of you on the panel, and in our projects here, I do work for the State Historic Preservation Office, and my elevator speech has turned into, we help people find historic resources in need of some assistance and help them turn the lights back on. That's our programs here to provide financial assistance, design assistance, planning assistance, and other such thing, working with the local municipalities, state government and federal government agencies, and individual investors and developers like they're on the panel here today, including at least one consultant I've worked with quite a bit. So we do have people who own buildings, people who work with buildings, people who develop buildings, and some financial people here today. So if you will, our first panelist will turn that over and give us a brief background of your project. Remember, we do have about 5 minutes per panelist, so I may actually say, let's move on to the next one. We want to make sure we get to the Q&A at the end of the session, okay? So are we starting with Eric? A lot going on there. Here we go. And I think the next slide we want to pick up with Eric. Perfect. Eric Unkoff.
Hi.
Hi. Are we moving on to the next one, Jeremy, or are we going to start with Eric?
Hi. Okay. Yeah. So I'm Eric Unkoff. I've redeveloped a few different mill-style buildings in the Glens Falls area. Next slide, please. This is a before picture of a building in Glens Falls. Used to be a former Nabisco warehouse built in 1924. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. The building was, when I purchased the building, it was a complete shell. And now we've got a commercial bakery in there, a cafe, a distillery, small batch food manufacturing, as well as some other small tenants. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the building next door, the one you just saw. This building is known as the Shirt Factory, which is what it was for about 100 years. It was built in 1902 and it was an addition in 1912. This is a picture of what the second floor looked like back around 1940. And what we've done with this building is turned it into about 80 working studios for artists, not living studios, not apartments, but actually just workshop areas for artists. And the average square footage of those spaces is about 800 square feet. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the exterior of the building from the courtyard side to just kind of give you an idea. Typical of construction from 1902, 1912. Next slide, please. And this is a typical artist workshop. There's everything in this building from artisans that work on stained glass restoration to this one's a violin maker, and then every conceivable media. Next slide, including ceramics, painting, sculpting, woodworking. We've had candle makers, glass blowers, etc. in the past. Next slide, please. One of the things that we've done here is in the warmer months, we've used the grounds for the building to host what we call Thursday Market Food Truck Corral, which this is a picture from last year, obviously, not this year. But it's grown into the largest weekly food truck related event between New York City and Montreal. And on a good week, provided the weather's nice, we'll attract between 2,000 and 3,000 people. And so this is just a picture of what we've got going on in the courtyard, but we have vendors that basically rim the whole property. And that's, I guess that's it for my introduction.
Okay, that was nice and speedy, Eric. We're going to try to save as much time at the end for Q&A. Eric has been looking at, was raised in Massachusetts and saw the opportunities all these vacant mills were happening, had for him. Upstate New York is really no different than a lot of Massachusetts with the empty mill buildings and underutilized mill areas and mill villages. So Eric has some experience in that. We'll hopefully bring up some questions at the end of the session about his experience in putting that building to use. Next is Jeff Morrell, who is Executive Vice President of the Rosenblum Companies. You're based in Albany, I believe, Jeff, but you work in the Capital District and taken on several projects with our office using underutilized or vacant or frankly abandoned buildings. So talk a little about your experience, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Next slide, please. And actually, we can skip through this. So, one critical piece of our development practice is that we really favor adaptive reuse and new construction infill, particularly in urban and urban adjacent locations with a focus on environmental sustainability and wellness. So we've done several adaptive reuse projects, the most significant to date, and the first for which we utilized New York State and federal historic tax credits was a historically sensitive conversion of this building, the Troy Record building in the city of Troy, New York, with, and that was combined with a complementary new addition for a mixed use market rate apartment building with amenities and ground floor retail. Next slide, please. The actually original Dutch colonial revival commercial corner building, which is located in the Central Troy Historic District, was built in 1906, but subsequent additions to the building were added in 1924, 1936, 1947, 1971, and in the 1980s. So we ended up with an interesting challenge, 51,000 square foot building over 4.5 floors and a basement, with different building materials based on the age of the addition, different elevations for the floor plates, and of course all the incumbent challenges of, an older building with deferred maintenance. Next slide, please. However, unlike, I'd say, many historic buildings that have seen their uses and tenants change over time, newspaper production, both editorial and mechanical, was the Troy Record building's only use in a first act that spanned a century before the building went dark and went for sale. For that reason, the Record newspaper and the building that housed it are uniquely entwined as both a literal and a symbolic cornerstone of the Troy community. It was a trusted source of information, a record keeper for places and people, and an employer for generations of Trojans. It's quite literally a town square. So it was definitely with a heavy sense of reverence and responsibility, as well as no shortage of trepidation, that we took on this project, which included removing the 1980s print room addition, restoring the southeast facade, preserving numerous historic interior elements and historic window reconstruction, facade repairs, and building envelope improvements. It also had to construct an atrium or a hyphen connecting the existing and new buildings, and then added high performance systems and amenities that include all geothermal heating and cooling, smart thermostats with wireless occupancy centers, obviously LED lighting, Energy Star appliances, WaterSense fixtures, porous pavement, separate compactors for trash and single stream recycling, and then other sort of green amenities like indoor bicycle storage and repair for our tenants and electric vehicle charging stations. Next slide, please. So this is just a shot of the kind of finished product, if you will, or refinished product. Next slide, please. This was the atrium, which kind of creates somewhat of an illusion that the buildings are complementary but separate, and also provided a great amenity space for our residents. Next slide. It's just a view from 6th Avenue. which was formerly a parking lot, sort of post-urban renewal. On the interior, it was critically important for us not just to acknowledge, but to really celebrate the building's important legacy because of its deep history. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we utilized to do that, in addition to utilizing all throughout historic photography that we were able to salvage from the beginning right up into through the 1990s and the 2000s when they shut down the last large offset press, were utilizing items that we were able to salvage from the record and remanufacturing those with Troy-based artisans into common area furniture and artwork. We also have oversized murals based on the historic photography that we commissioned from local artists. Next slide, please. And next slide. And we were also able to leverage a lot of amenity space for our residents, which was unique in a downtown to have so many robust in-building amenities. Next slide, please. And you can just kind of move through these, Julian, just a couple of evolutionary shots. That's the model unit. Cleared out and the final product.
Okay, thanks, Jeff. Thank you. Our next presenter, Mike Puma. He is a partner at Preservation Studios, which is an historic preservation consulting firm based in Buffalo, New York. They do have a lot of work across the state and have in the last couple of years become very active in the capital region, assisting, well, you're probably coming with 100 more projects in the capital district, I believe. Some very large scale ones in Clinton Avenue, doing affordable housing, as well as market rate, as well as other situations there. So Mike, I'm going to introduce you and talk about your role in what's been going on, and take it away.
Thanks, Julian. Unfortunately, I don't have any visuals, so everyone's sort of stuck looking at my funny mug there for a couple minutes here. But as Julian indicated, my primary role is serving as a historic preservation consultant. My function at Preservation Studios is largely on client intake, client communications, but predominantly on the technical services side of things for getting folks through the comprehensive reviews for what we have at buildings and what we want to do with them and all the millions of small items in between those two things. So during my time at Preservation Studios, we've capitalized on about $250,000 of historic, or $250 million of historic tax credits across New York State. So we're very active. We've got projects as small as a single row house to as big as 150,000 square foot warehouse and everything in between. So we've obviously encountered a lot of different building types across the state, of which the capital region sort of has a microcosm of all of those: row houses, movie theaters, etc. For those that are from that region, of course, you know that very well. In our experience, you know, it's really important to sort of get a good team together from the onset. I know that folks that are on the development side of things are very well aware of that. So we've been lucky that across my near decade of working in historic preservation, that a lot of the teams that we've been a part of have been really good and have come up with really good solutions to complex problems. So my role at Pres Studios is basically as a problem solver. Our company is a little bit unique in so much as that we don't do architectural services. We do have a couple of people on staff that are trained architects, but not licensed. But we have a unique perspective on things because one of my business partners, as well as one of my staffers, are both lawyers and experts in historic tax credits. So we're able to sort of come to a project and not only get it up and running for eligibility if it's not already listed on the National Register, but also get it through the rehabilitation process for compliance with the standards and speak to the complications about how the tax credits work, what is eligible, what's not, in a lot of very particular situations that have cropped up over the years out of really unique sort of case study type projects. We've worked with both private developers, municipalities, nonprofits. Nonprofits and tax credits don't always mix, but there's an opportunity every once in a while for that to work out for a number of different reasons. We've worked closely with Julian over the years for both historic tax credit reviews, but also compliance projects. Probably most notably, but not actually in the capital region, was the Albright Knox Art Gallery expansion out here in Buffalo, where we worked with OMA and the gallery staff to help them position a good spot for the required addition at the building, but also treat the existing historic structures spanning from 1901 and 1962 in a sensitive manner, which was a lot of delicate work over the course of several years, which was thankfully aided by the folks over at the SHPO office. A lot of the buildings that we've encountered in the capital region are comparable to ones we've seen so far, you know, former office buildings or mill buildings, a lot of row houses. As Julian indicated, one of our signature projects, for lack of a better term, is the rehabilitation of about 70 row houses along Clinton Avenue and Tenbrook. The buildings were actually brought through the program back in the 1980s. And after 30 plus years of use, they were ready for rehab again. Some were a little bit better than others, and others were complete disasters. So we had to effectively mobilize, with our current workload at the time, an additional 70 buildings, all of which had varying conditions across the board on a time frame that both made sense for getting the project started from a construction standpoint, but also meeting a litany of investor requirements for a bunch of different needs related to approvals, timing, hand-holding on the tax credit administration side, and a lot of in between. A lot of what I end up having to do is sort of plan on the fly. You know, a lot of things in the preservation world are black and white, but probably equally as much are in the gray area. So we try to take a holistic approach on the forefront to a building. We, you know, identify the things that we absolutely can't move on, the things that are clearly fine just to toss in the trash and start over. But a lot of things are gray in between, and it's a delicate balancing act between getting the program that our clients need or want in the historic building and making sure that we're sort of bumping right up along the line to what the standards are calling for.
Okay, thank you, Michael. That's a good introduction. I have some questions for so far. 3 of you so far have been writing down. We also have a question coming into Q&A. I'll hold to the Q&A time. We do have some public questions coming in on the Q&A, and they're being processed up to me. So we'll start from that, but we're going to go to Bill. Bill, you look to be muted right now. There you go. Perfect. Bill Tater, I've worked with him on several projects, also large-scale projects in the Utica area. Where else have I? Buffalo, Utica? You say Buffalo as well. I always don't know every player in the projects. I know people I deal with every day, but I know I've met you at least once at a project. He is co-founder of the Small Business Solutions Center. That is located in where, Bill?
Saratoga Springs.
Saratoga Springs. It assists its clients with strategic planning, communication, business development, government relations, public affairs, a little bit of everything there. Yep. Putting together use mix, secure commercial tenants, public approvals, and long-term incentives supporting mixed-use real estate projects. So, Bill, if you would like to talk a little about your work, and we'll have some questions for you, I'm sure, as well.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and a great panel so far. I'm familiar with a lot of the projects we've seen, and certainly admire the Troy Record Building, Jeff, and thanks for taking me to see it. It was amazing. Folks who haven't seen it yet, they really did an incredible job. Yeah, as Julian said at the outset, we're all products of our experience, and truthfully, I come at this maybe a little different than some of the other folks, which is what makes a great team. Really centered around community-minded development and impact investment. And it's a product of, you know, having been in community service and community outreach roles throughout my earlier career. So in my role, I tend to try and identify the wants and needs of a community through their community leaders and stakeholders, whether they're economic developers, elected officials, obviously planning community and staff, many of whom are on this call, and we know many of them and appreciate working in the work you do. I've collaborated primarily on the projects that we'll focus on today with KCG Development. They're a 5-year-old firm operating in about 6 states now, and they're a top 10 affordable tax credit finance developer already in that short time frame in the nation. We brought them, Do Ventures, my small firm, brought them to upstate New York, specifically to try and mobilize new investment, new capital around historic adaptive reuse, and then also community-minded new development in either transitioning or underserved parts of the community. As an example, I don't know if Stacy Kaplowitz, who sends her regrets, by the way, she and I worked really well together and enjoy it. She may have provided some photos, I'm not sure, but an AP loss case in Buffalo, to start there, that was our first project. The firm KCG was started in 2015. I transitioned ownership or purchase and sale agreement rights over to them. And it took a great deal of effort to convert this old cold storage warehouse. The APT house is about a mile due east in downtown Buffalo of the Harbor Center, where a great deal of investment has occurred. And I'm happy to say, after 2 years of a pretty complex build out, we had to core the center of this entire cubic building in order to create light on a double, for the units around the edge of the cube, and a center roof for interior parking. We were actually able to park the entire building. Every unit has space inside, which isn't a bad thing in downtown Buffalo. So that roughly $45 million project is 147 units, fully stabilized. It's been renting up since November 2018. And we were also able, which I really love to try and do, to create a space for a startup brewery, which is called the Beltline Brewery. And they've been doing wonderful food and beverage on site in the commercial space that we were able to make available to them at a very reasonable rate to give them their launch. And they're surviving and then even thriving coming out the other end of this difficult pandemic. That was a historic combination and affordable combination of tax credits. And switching gears over to Globe Mill Utica, similarly, we had that under control for some time. KCG was formed and we were able to transition the rights to that wonderful old woolen mill to KCG for development. That is a project that's got one heck of a capital stack. It's got 2 sources of historic credit, 2 sources of affordable tax credit. And we did discover petroleum and its brownfield cleanup program admitted, approved, and there's credits associated with that cleanup. It's passion play for us too. It's at a transitioning corridor, the brewery district in Utica, which is becoming much more vibrant and then kind of that live, work, play, I hate to use that phrase, but area of the city. It's directly across from the Mats and Saranac Brewery, which is going through a great modernization, $22 million update and expansion with that wonderful family, 130 some odd years in the business. We're right across the street at the Boilermaker for any upstaters who know that road race, running race. It's the finish line, so kind of cool place to be. And 3 old mills make up the complex today and a couple of outbuildings. So we're renting up currently mill number 4, which is a smaller 4-story building, and then mills 1 and 2, which connect, and together they form an L around a block, will be completed roughly around the end of the year. Probably won't start leasing up the larger buildings till January, February of this coming 2021. That just grew over time with those cleanup requirements and other elements that we added to a $55 million project. And really proud of that. It took a lot of time and energy to get to this point, but a great example of a historic adaptive reuse. There's 9,000 square feet of unsubscribed commercial space, which we're being patient and collaborating with community leaders to try and find, the right type of office or co-worker or some sort of, interesting tenant to use. The outbuildings there have some interesting space, and one of the spaces is incredible, the original mill operator, mill CEO, Woodworks office suite. Transitioning a bit, I'm going to speak a little bit more and hopefully even more on this in the Q&A. My role, again, centered from a product of experience, is around community engagement. So I'm sort of the party in a project team that's really going to try and frame the narrative, as I like to put it, around the wants, needs, and opportunities to help address community needs. And I'm a big believer in being very intentional about that engagement with community voices that represent the diverse interests of those communities in order to try and get to a YIMBY, a yes in my backyard project. But like all of us, I'm sure, I just went through a couple successes. We have some certain failures. One of the ones listed here, Chalmers Mill Loft redevelopment in Amsterdam. Happy to speak about it if it's instructive, but it's one that we're not going to get over the hump, it looks like, unfortunately. We certainly engage very intentionally with county and city leaders and community leaders to get a great, robust redevelopment of a former brownfield. But there's a handful of leaders that just don't think it's the appropriate type of project for their city. So it doesn't look like we're going to be able to deliver that $33 million investment to Amsterdam. After all, we're certainly actively interested in trying to find the right type of user that will meet those community leaders' needs and help set them up with that great site. It's right on the Erie Canal corridor, right on the Mohawk River, a wonderful site, 3-acre site. So we do what we say we'll do. That's what we pride ourselves on. We intentionally engage with stakeholders early and then try to constantly keep it closed, or a feedback loop going. So we adapt and continue to tell the public the same story about our projects and our intentions and any improvements we make. Again, maybe not always every developer's approach, but I'm a big believer if you're not telling the story, someone else is. So I'd rather engage with the key stakeholders, understand the wants and needs, define those early as a compelling project narrative, and then keep a sustained loop of communication going on with any community planning team, any community officials.
Bill, I think if you can wrap a little, we're going to try to get to our Q&A. It's a lot of good information in there, but I want to make sure we have enough time for questions answered as well.
Yeah,
okay?
No problem. So
you're like me, you get wound up and it's hard to stop. I totally understand it.
Understandable. But I get it. With that, that's basically where I play that role in terms of the community.
Because I think there's some good questions for you coming up as well as in the near future right here.
No
I do want to take one question from the Q&A, and then we're going to have some other questions that'll start some conversation. This is for Jeff. It says, can you talk about how your firm became involved in the Troy bid project?
Sure. We were and still are very enthusiastic about Troy, and we had been looking for opportunities to do a project after the success of our 17 Chapel boutique condominium project, which was a conversion and vertical addition of a cast in place concrete former auto dealership built circa 1928, which was also one of the earliest multifamily projects in downtown Albany's current sort of downtown housing renaissance. Interestingly, I mean, in addition to the building itself, which we, as difficult as it was, we kind of just fell in love with, one of the most attractive elements of the property was that there was this underdeveloped parking lot. And while it was the greatest challenge, it was also the greatest reward that we kind of had this opportunity to cauterize this wound from urban renewal, not just by breathing new life back into the existing building, but creating the new building and remaking that surrounding streetscape on Broadway and 6th, which was at that time just beyond the reach of the downtown renewal that Troy was experiencing.
Okay, thank you. I think that's good. And as a Troy resident, we welcome that cauterization. I like that word very much. I hadn't thought of that before. I think it was Prince Charles that says reweaving the urban fabric that was torn, but you're taking a much more surgical approach to it, which I think is needed in some regard. So thank you for that.
It feels like
I do want to ask a question of Eric. Eric, you there? You got us, Eric?
Yep.
Hi. I just want to make sure. It's kind of funny managing it like this, so trust me. I want to know, you've got quite a bit of different users in your building. I mean, that's a challenge not only to do a project, but to fill it like that. Where did you find these people? How did you recruit them?
Well, it's it's a little bit, my build out's probably a little bit different than the way any of these other projects go. So I've done 4 different buildings, and I just start at one end and I get somebody that's interested in the space, and we say this is how much space it is, and we say that's where the wall is going to be, and then I go find somebody for the space adjacent to it. And the building is redeveloped very organically. So there's not 2 spaces that are exactly the same size or exactly the same layout. It's basically built to suit, but that's how we filled up when I started on the shirt factory building, this was in 1999. I figured, oh well, I'm just going to be able to rent out like big chunks or a floor at a time, and that didn't happen. But we started getting some artists knocking on our door, and we're like, sure, we'll build out a little space for you as an artist. And then another one came, and another one came. So I'd like to say it was some brilliant marketing plan on my part, but it was actually the natural light in this building in particular is incredible. And it really got around in the local community that, hey, you've got to have a space in this building. And once we started, the building kind of sold itself, so to speak.
So
and
kind
the
of
way
word
it
of
is
mouth.
now, I typically have. It was very much word of mouth. It was very much word of mouth. Yeah.
So no big marketing campaign. That's interesting because
No,
again,
no.
you tapped into a community that needed that space. So there was you got it, you built it, and they came in bits and pieces. It sounds like that's good to know.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Okay, good. I need to get up there and check that out. It's just up the road sometime. It's good. I do have a question that came in from Q&A, and anyone can address this if they wish. Jeff, you might, Mike, you have, and Bill, we'll see what happened if you got an answer for this. How do we get city leaders to move past the fixation with parking minimums? That's an interesting one that people have been dealing with through code issues, green code, or how do you deal with that in your projects? Jeff, you've had to deal with that.
Yeah, we hate building parking, as a sustainable developer. And, we really try to, as I mentioned, encourage the use of mass transit and micromobility. But, I wouldn't actually lay it at the feet of city leaders, at least in the capital region. We're a very car-centric region, and people have become very accustomed to, getting from place to place. And the reason is, unfortunately, that's sort of the way we're architected. We're a lot of city centers with a lot of concrete spaghetti in between. And, so we're all kind of suffering from the sins of our forefathers and four people.
Four persons.
Yeah, sorry, four persons. And so, I think that it's again, not just so much city officials, but there is a general, the communities, the neighborhoods, the small businesses, all of them bring up the parking issue. And if anything, I think officials are responding to the constituency that's very concerned about where we park. I think, you have to take, one of our core values of the company is to take a long view. So I think you have to architect as much of the long view into the short term. And what I mean by that is really looking at, if we're building parking on a site, particularly structured parking, one, how do we hide that from, how do we make sure that that's not visible? Because, particularly, open surface lots are really inappropriate to the urban landscape. But two, as the dependence on automobiles decreases over time, how do we, how do we convert those spaces into something else, and how do we make sure, so, if it's building parking garages without ramping and thinking about what that can be converted to using storefront glass, sort of building the basic elements that could then be evolved into a different use of that space. That's how we're sort of addressing it.
And I know that over at the news, there is covered parking that has frosted glass on the streetscape. So you see some light, some activity back there, and you have a blank wall, because that's very important to urbanity as well. As you don't walk past blank walls and create quite the dead space. Yeah,
we're actually doubling down on that with the newest project, which we're just opening, Vicina, where on 4th Street, where we have that same sort of construct where there's structured parking, but we're actually creating shallow storefronts between the parking and the street that we can activate in partnership with local groups like the Rensselaer County Historic Society, or perhaps the RPI Lighting Lab, and a color city works, different arts groups. So it's not just sort of that, it's not just a screen or kind of camouflage, but it becomes an activated space.
I think that's a great idea. Mike, I want to address a question toward you. You sometimes are the hinge between the bureaucracy and the developer. What do you see as the biggest challenge there? What's your greatest joy or frustration?
I think the biggest challenge is trying to be right on that line of making sure that we're protecting the client's interests and giving it a fair shake. And we're trying to evaluate if it's got feasibility for ultimate approval from both your office and at the national level, which we know you guys tend to be a little bit more understanding than the folks at the national level, so more often than not. So obviously early engagement with you guys is critical, especially for projects that we know we're going to have a couple potential speed bumps along the way, getting those things out of the way as early as possible, or at least getting a good understanding of where we might land. For really tricky situations, what I've tried to do to make sure that I'm staying in my client's corner, but also coming up with something that's reasonable, is to say, well, if you really want this, let's go with it. But let's now, while we're still developing our part 2, come up with a plan B, because the last thing we want to do is be caught flat-footed a month from now or 3 months from now, and then try to have to scramble, especially when you've got requirements by both investors, tax credit investors, banks, to try to get those approval letters stamped on a certain time frame. So I'm always trying to build in redundancy when it's an option, if we think option A might be getting pushed back.
Okay. I've got 2 questions from the field, I guess, from the Q&A. The first one I think is to be directed toward Mike, and the second one I'm going to open up to other issues. Mike, first question. Does Preservation Studios ever exchange services for equity shares in a project?
Sort of. I mean, we've considered it. I guess
a solid answer.
Yeah. We would be open to it. Right now, with everything that's going on with COVID, it's sort of a bit unpredictable to figure out how your coffers are going to be filled. We've been very lucky that there's been, I don't know, Julian, about every 2 years, there's some sort of crisis meltdown at the state, federal, local levels for the attack on historic tax credits. And surprisingly, a worldwide pandemic has actually not slowed down business. So we finally got a break after like 15 years of getting beat up every 2 years. We had considered investing in real estate deals to either reduce or eliminate our consulting fees in the past. Now, I forgot to include this on my bio because I sort of forget it sometimes. We are doing real estate development ourselves. We've actually purchased several buildings here, which is going to be about a $7 million rehab, 20 apartments, 10,000 square feet of commercial space, and a former automobile showroom, and some of its associated buildings across the street on a smaller scale. So open to it for sure. It depends on the project, but we haven't done much of it to date.
That one came from Benjamin Biddle, so you may get a call from him. I'm not sure what that's about. This one's more of an open call, and Bill, you might be the best person to direct this to. First off, are tax credits being monetized for the projects you work with? And if so, what's the market like and who's buying?
Yeah, they're definitely being monetized. Jeff, I'm sure, can chime in on the rate. Folks at KCG who syndicate, their founder, RJ Pasquesi, came from a career in tax credit syndication. So both our affordable credits and our historic federal and state credits are monetized as part of the equity stack to leverage very minimal debt. In our case, where we're doing primarily affordable, the workforce or mixed income housing. So yeah, they're sold through syndicators, commonly to insurance companies, commercial banks, major institutions like that leverage those credits to realize gains, slight upticks in their profitability. But as we project it, when we go to a community like Utica, as an example, or anywhere in upstate, we're bringing new capital to that community that would not normally invest there. So we're not taking the credits on our project. We're selling those credits to activate high equity stakes as an investment into a community we do projects in. And generally, the federal credits are getting more money than the state credit, right? More marketable. So federal credit's going to sell in the 90 some odd cents per dollar range, and a state credit may sell in like the 60 to 70 cents range. Michael, Jeff, anybody maybe more recent, that's over years, the last several years, maybe a range or an average.
I think the biggest problem is you can market the feds nationwide and the states only New York State. So it has limited the investor pool there. We keep pushing, trying to get things changed, the state credit up, the state credit moved around. This year, with the budget issues, we're not sure how much traction we have, but we're going to probably still push regardless on that because we do handle legislative ideas on that issue and write some legislation. I do want to ask, I'm going to ask this back of Jeff. How do you find the buildings?
Boy, you know, it's always better to find an off-market deal than an on-market deal. It's a question of spending time in the communities, keeping your eye on the listings, you know, having an idea of where you want to be, and you know, it's. I don't think there's, you know, one method or secret sauce to it, you know, and frankly, you know, a lot of developers can look at the same property and it's that one sort of developer who figures out the algorithm of, you know, how to put together a project that's going to provide a suitable return for their investors. And, you know, we've looked at properties and then kicked ourselves later because, you know, we're just envious of, you know, our colleagues who've put together the project and made something really beautiful. You know, and for us too, because we're a combination of both historic, you know, we're always looking for adaptive reuse or repositioning obsolete product. We're also investing in infill. So, you know, it can take some imagination, I'd say sometimes to sort of, you know, and then quite a bit of community and stakeholder engagement and thought about, you know, how do you, particularly in a dense urban environment, you know, create something that's appropriate for the historic urban fabric, utilizing modern materials and building practices. It's like I said, I wish I had a more direct answer, like, well, you dial 1-800-REAL estate and they tell you what project to do next.
Go on Zillow.
Yeah, it really is having a good eye, you know.
Bill, you have a point?
That, Julian, and Jeff touched on it, envy, but in the best sense, because Jeff, I saw that building years in Troy Records case, years ahead of it, but I didn't have the right partner. KCG wasn't on the scene yet. The Meridians building in Troy, I was in all of those, 701 River, the record, and I didn't have the right partner, the right algorithm, as you put it, to get the control to take it down and do the projects. But as an example, I'll offer up one idea, like how did we come across AP Lofts, a big giant cube. It's kind of a mini version, by the way, of the White Whale on 787. And then Globe Mill in Utica. And it's, for me, I like to go out through the economic development offices. And yes, there's definitely listings, but frequently they have, I'd hate to call it a pocket listing, but they certainly have relationships and eyes and ears on the ground in a community around, and the way we like to approach it, similar to what I think all of us think like this on this call, is what is a driver? What are people looking for? What are the gaps in their market? What are the needs? And so I'll frequently start with those planners if they don't have an economic developer or an economic development agency, to kind of just pick the brains of owners they know in the community who've been interested, approach them and said, hey, if you ever hear from somebody and we can unload this, we're interested. That's how both of those happened in AP and Globe Mill. And frankly, it was also that I driving around with a kind of an idea around what we wanted to do, especially with the historic assets, and just kind of getting the first glimpse in the neighborhood and like walking in that building. I picture the day walking in to Globe Mill and the snow started in the fall and be like, this is it. Like, and then the partners agree. They're like, we got to get this controlled. And it was an owner who was an amazing guy who was just looking and ready to make the move. He had already bought out a bunch of his partners, owned it for like 50 years. So anyway, that's an example.
Yeah.
Now, Eric, you seem to find yours just by going to an auction there? Mm-hmm. You got it happen on yours?
Well, yeah, so there was in 1996, there was an auction in the property. to sell off the remainder of the equipment that was in the building. And, I went into the building and I kind of fell in love with it. And I was like, I'm going to do something with this. Originally, I was going to move part of my manufacturing into the machine shop into the basement of this building. And it never happened. What happened was, as I started splitting it up, there was huge demand for space in the building. And I was like, well, I'll go buy another building to expand into, which I wound up buying a former paper mill as my next purchase. But when you walk into the right building, it's the right building. I mean, and down at the former paper mill, I had one space open up, and it was where the paper machines had been, and there's 30-foot ceilings, and that space alone, I think, is about 30,000 square foot, and we put an indoor turfed area in there for indoor sporting, and that's doing fairly well. I like to try and, it's from walking, being in the building and kind of really pondering what the use is instead of forcing a use that won't fit in the building and doing a lot of demolition and reconstruction. I try and do things that kind of fit naturally at some level with what I'm working with.
That's one of the first things we look for in a rehab. There we use the Secretary of the Interior Standards for Rehabilitation, which are 10 guidelines. I always say, like the 10 Commandments have had tons of books written on them. There's a lot of interpretation of the standards as well. But standard 1 is find a use for a building that does not require significant alteration of its original historic characteristics. In other words, don't fight the building. Use what would go well in it. I think, Eric, you took a great angle on that one. Mike, you had a point to make as well?
Yeah, and I'll be brief since we've been on this topic for a little while. I got sort of a two-pronged point. My background is actually urban planning. That's what I went to school for. So in my experience, the most successful projects tend to be bottom up as it relates to trying to go to the community and say, what do you want to see here? Especially if there's already a building you've potentially identified in the neighborhood that you think might be a good opportunity. That it might also potentially feed into combating the city on parking minimums, because if you can have a conversation with a community where the city hasn't actually been active, you can sort of get ahead of that conversation and say, well, nobody lauds great cities for their proliferation of parking. It's about what's happening in an urban core. Nobody goes on vacation and just to go stare at surface lots. So if you can get ahead of that from a ground up approach, that's a good way to do it. And obviously just sort of keeping your eyes out as you're going around your daily business. Obviously we all have errands to run. Just sort of at your stoplight, you might not notice a building you've passed by a million times before that sort of catches your eye a certain day. That's sort of what happened with our building. It had actually been encapsulated with metal siding in 1976. And just because I'm always sort of keeping my eyes open, when I was shopping there, when it was a record store, I looked up and thought, sort of weird that there's a plaster barrel vaulted ceiling in what's otherwise a furred out drywall space in a metal clad building. Dug up the blueprints years ago, and when the building came up for sale from the estate, we knew that there was a historic building under there, and we were pretty confident that it would be eligible for tax credits if we took all the junk off of it and all the junk out of the showroom. And a lot of developers, many of whom that we've worked with, passed on the building. It is a challenging building because of its shape and one-story nature. But I think a lot of them, especially in a place like Buffalo, realize that, look at this thing, it's probably not eligible for tax credits. It's not even worth looking into. But we sort of knew where the bodies were buried on that one, and we were able to sneak in there for a really good price. And we've subsequently taken the metal off and gutted the showroom, and 90% of the building's still there. And since it had been covered over for about 40 years, everyone sort of forgot. So just keeping your eyes out is crucial.
Yeah, and some imagination. I have a horrible thing I say about a lot of people. There doesn't seem to be a lot of imagination out there in some people's minds, but it takes imagination, it takes thought, it takes an eye. Opportunity can be in the most interesting locations, but if you're looking at it only one-dimensionally, you're not going to find it. I just want to give a quick plug. My commissioner would not forgive me if I didn't give a quick plug for our programs. One of the programs I run here is the federal and state historic tax credit program. We help people identify buildings that may be eligible for them, move them into that eligibility slot, and work with them on the applications, the designs, sometimes other aspects, material issues, trying to help them design a project that will get approved for those credits. There's a federal program of 20%, and the state piggybacks on it for another 20 in what we call qualified census tracts, which is an enormous amount of upstate New York. You'd be surprised if I'd be surprised if a building isn't in it lately, upstate. And what we do is we get those approved, and that can be used, as Bill was mentioning, as equity on the market. You can also use it against income taxes owed on the building for smaller scale projects. We see everything from what I call mom and pop stores on corners with apartments up above to literally 1 million square foot building in Rochester we've been working on in 5 phases. We do everything from small scale projects. We actually have a $1 billion project on the books right now, which I keep thinking maybe my capstone. After that, I'll have to leave the office. It's such a whopper. But we do help anybody. I would say if anybody on the watching this, attending this, reach out to our office. We can be found at the New York State Historic Preservation Office on Google. We're parts of the Office of Parks, Recreation, Historic Preservation. If you can go there, look for historic preservation. And you can surf your way to one of our people there and email us and call us if you will. We have just a few minutes left. I'd like to know if anybody has any kind of wrap-up moments or wrap-up ideas or things that popped in your head you'd like to say before we sign off.
Julian, I would just ask you to maybe
Sure.
give a quick snapshot of what's eligible. You know, what is a good range to thumbnail an eligible historic site?
I'd say anything. We see everything from large single-family houses in neighborhoods being turned into multiple units, or maybe a large single-family house, and we have one of those coming up pretty soon that can surprise me. We do downtown buildings, or 3-story, three-bay commercial buildings with apartments or offices historically above. A lot of those are turning into apartments as our downtowns fill with what we call the young creatives, which is really a thing. A lot of things, particularly in the Capital District right now. Old hotels being turned back into hotels, or other issues. Factory buildings are like the Globe Mills. Those large open plates, 4 plates, give a lot of room and a lot of character to individual buildings. We see former light industry buildings and office buildings like the Troy Record Structure. That AP Loft building, which was A&P Warehouse, was, I didn't think that would pull off, and somehow you did.
Yeah.
We see neighborhood revitalizations like the 70 row houses in Clinton Avenue. We have had former brewery buildings being turned into apartments and offices. I think an interesting thing is the mixed use. People can do a single use building, but mixed use is also quite creative. The one in Rochester, the former Sibley's department store in downtown, massive, like it's 1 million square feet. They've got retail, they've got offices, they've got maker space, they've got a market housing, they've got affordable housing. It's a little bit of everything in that building, because it's just a large building to have a single use in the downtown Rochester. So they're basically doing a one-man band. Everything going into downtown you need is in that building. Again, I think it comes back to imagination and looking around and seeing. Of course, the financials have to work. We're aware of that. So we try to work with people to bring those dollars to the table to make sure that happen, and work with people. So Jeff, you bring the projects. Bill, you bring the money sometimes. Mike, you work with the in between there. Eric, I want to see one of your projects come through pretty soon. That's what I want to see, you come up with something and see what we can do for you there. Yes, I need to get up and look at your project Glens Falls. That's a great example of what one person is doing up there in a way that maybe not what other people are thinking of. Most people try to think of an A to Z project, bing, bam, boom, do it all, rent it out. You seem to have taken that organic approach, as you say, that I think is also a very important thing to do in these historic buildings in our downtowns. There's room for everybody in that. I really think that. So we're at 12:58. Jeremy, how are we doing? Are we okay?
I think that was perfect. Thank you, Julian. I really appreciate it. Especially appreciate you moderating this session. And thank you to all the other panelists, Eric, Bill, Jeff, Mike, and obviously Stacy unfortunately couldn't be with us, but you know, she was part of this conversation for a while as well, and I thank her for her time. And thank you to our attendees who have joined us. We had a pretty large attendance, and it was a good Q&A session, so thank you for everyone who provided some questions for the panel. And I hope today's event is a good example of the type of engaging discussions the attendees will receive throughout this conference. I'd be remiss if I don't mention before we go that I want to quickly remind everyone to please visit the chapter website, which is www.newyorkupstateplanning.org for the complete list of conference sessions coming up. And if you would like to access the recording for this session. And once again, thank you, everyone. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Rodney.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks a lot.